Hello and welcome to the Common Good Podcast. My name is Dan Deitrich. I'm your host today. As Russian tanks and troops invade our peaceful, democratic ally Ukraine, the conversation about how we as a nation respond to war and violence moves from the theoretical to the real and urgent. Last week, we recorded a conversation with David Cramer and Myles Werntz to talk about their new book, A Fieldguide to Christian Nonviolence. This conversation is more relevant and urgent than ever, and if I'm honest, I really struggle with some of the implications. If you're like me and you see a bully, whether it's in the middle school gym class or if it's a petty tyrant like Putin, you want to stop them. You want to prevent them from inflicting pain on others. But maybe nonviolence isn't the same thing as sitting quietly on the sidelines. As we'll see, the long history of Christian nonviolence actively works against war and oppression, even when it's costly. So let's get into our conversation. This is David Cramer and Myles Werntz, A Fieldguide to Christian Nonviolence.
All right, well, we're talking with David Cramer and Myles Werntz about the book, A Fieldguide to Christian Nonviolence. And guys, I am so excited about this conversation because I'm someone who's been trying to advocate for Christian nonviolence for a really long time. And it's really hard to do. So thanks for writing a book about it and a field guide about it. And you are both professors. You obviously care about these issues, and you've scanned and looked over the entirety of the Christian nonviolence enterprise for the last couple of centuries. First of all, would one of you tell us when someone asks you what is Christian nonviolence? How do you answer that question? Because most people just say to me like, oh, so you're a pacifist? And then we're into another conversation, which feels like we're talking about only war and all the rest of it. When you talk about Christian nonviolence, how do you frame it?
Yeah, I think the first thing we would say is that it's a tradition. It's a living and breathing tradition. And as with any tradition, there's going to be internal disagreements, contradictions, some alignment. But a lot of what we are trying to do in the book is to say this isn't one settled position, and you can't just say I'm a pacifist or I'm a card-carrying advocate of Christian nonviolence and have that mean one particular thing. So I can't really boil it down to a short answer because that sort of defeats the purposes of the book, which is to say there's all kinds of different ways of coming at this question. I mean, I guess at its basic would be a refusal to take life. But there's all kinds of different logics to how you get to that conclusion.
Yeah, I would echo David. I think that that's a good summation of it. Part of what is so interesting, what was so interesting about writing the book, is that there are so many different moving pieces with respect to among the different figures as to what counts as nonviolence, where does it begin, what is its aim. What's the point of doing this? What sources do we draw from? There's just such a diversity there that it's hard to kind of pigeonhole it apart from, I think what David identified is to say that, the refusal to take life. And I think the refusal to take life because of the person and the person of Jesus. I think that's where it comes down to.
Yeah, that seems like it's sort of the Christian side to it. It's funny because that's where I root myself, right? Look, Jesus' teaching is for another kind of way and another kind of life, and killing one another using violence and coercion and force. That just doesn't fit. And yet, that seems to be really out of step with the history of the Christian tradition, right? In some way, like you just look over the history of the church, and it has done that in times past, and there's so much of that now. I think about pastors who are trained often by the demand of their insurance companies to put armed guards in their churches, armed people prepared to shoot and kill if someone wants to cause harm in a church building. So it feels like those of us who talk about Christian nonviolence are just talking about like taking parts of Jesus's teaching more seriously than what sort of matches the Christian tradition. But your book allows people to see that, well, that's not actually the case. Some people have really been taking this seriously for a very long time, even though the majority see it differently.
Yeah, that's right. We focus largely on the 20th and 21st century, where we see really a proliferation of different kinds of violence in the world. And so, as a result, within the Christian tradition, a proliferation of responses to that. So, in the wake of world wars, in the wake of nuclear armament, Vietnam, terrorism, and an increasing awareness of sexualized violence in the home and church, we see people stepping up to respond to that in creative new ways. And so, there are other books that will do a whole genealogy of war and peace throughout the whole tradition of the church. And there's, I'm a Mennonite, and we kind of have this declension narrative of like, well, the early church was following Jesus, and then with Constantine, you had the synthesis of kind of church and state, and that's when everything went wrong. And then, of course, the heroes are the radical reformers that sort of break from that. And that's, a simplistic telling of the story. But I do think there is something to be said for that distance between church and state, where a lot of what's going on in contemporary evangelicalism, especially in America, is, this Christian nationalism movement. And I feel like that isn't necessarily directly tied to violence, but there is a large component of violence associated with that. And to me, that is a danger. And I would view that as a distortion of Jesus's teaching.
Myles, how about you? Do you see that? Like, I feel like your book is look, Christian nonviolence has been something that people have been talking about the whole time, right? From the Gospels and all the way before. In any expression of Christian tradition, people have been talking about it. But watching armed insurrectionists with Christian flags and Trump flags attack the U.S. Capitol and beat police forces with those very flags, and calling for the invocation of a Christian narrative and Christian violence in the U.S. Senate seems to have sharpened the mind of some of us, at least for the last 12 months or so. That may all fade away. It does feel like this is as important of a question as ever.
Yeah, no, I think that the question of the relationship between Christianity and violence has always been it's been a very interesting one and a very fraught one for a long time. So this is where I might want to disagree with like the Anabaptist telling of the story just a little bit, and that you still have Christians like between the 4th and the 16th century who are talking about this, but it does get kind of minimized and retained only in kind of very specific kinds of ways. So you have all sorts of like admonitions against, say, monastics picking up weapons or clerics picking up weapons. That it's fine for like regular folk, but it's not fine for the folks who are administering the sacraments. I think that this is a part of what is so compelling about this topic, and has been compelling for David and myself for a number of years now, is that this seems to be a foregone conclusion that the use of violence is something which is not only permissible, but it's something that should be just taken as the norm for Christians. So for both of us, if you're talking about like an origin story of this book, it goes all the way back, I think, to 2001, and that both of us in different ways began asking the question in the wake of 9/11 about what that relationship between Christianity and violence should look like. And so in some ways, this is the culmination of a long period of writing and thinking and reflecting and discipleship for both of us to kind of put this out there for other people to be able to hopefully benefit from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, just as 9/11 was a clarifying moment for Myles and myself, my hope is that January 6th can be a clarifying moment for others, maybe those who were lulled into going along with a certain stream of Christianity, but then when they see kind of that's the culmination of it, saying, oh my goodness, that is so clearly incompatible with what I hold to be true, that they're going to look in other directions. And so maybe this tradition of Christian nonviolence could be a direction they might want to explore.
Yeah. It might not be that they come away taking a hard line on Christian pacifism, but they'll look at that and say, "Yep, that's not it. I don't know what it is, but
I don't have all the answers, but it's not that." Yeah,
but it's not that. Right.
One of the biggest pushbacks to Christian nonviolence is the idea that at some point you have to use violence to protect vulnerable people. Is that an open discussion within this conversation? What are some of the ideas around that tension?
I mean, I take it to be an open discussion. David, what do you?
Yeah, I think how you define love of neighbor and love of enemy is going to really affect how you answer that question. And if the tradition of Christian nonviolence has nothing to say about how to love and protect the vulnerable, then I think, that is going to be pretty problematic. But one of the things we show in the book is that nonviolence isn't just a refusal to engage in any kind of resistance, but actually there are forms of nonviolence that are very actively resisting violence in the world. And so in some ways, some of the forms of nonviolence are addressing conditions upstream from the situation you're describing to say, can we start to undo forms of violence that may manifest themselves in oppression of the vulnerable, or there's always going to be tragedies. There's always going to be, school shootings, unfortunately, or home invasions or whatever. And I don't think there's a silver bullet, to use a bad violent analogy there, to stop all that. But I don't think the tradition of Christian nonviolence simply says we just sit back in the wake of that and let it wash over us. I think there are a lot of creative ways to engage without the intention to certainly kill, but even harm those who are also considered your enemies.
One of the I think the misunderstandings about Christian nonviolence is that all of it is equated with something that happens in the 16th century, which is the Schleitheim Confession, which emphasizes what's called non-resistance. So when Jesus says, "Don't resist the evildoer," they take that as kind of the mantra for what. Like, this is our relationship to violence. We emphasize kind of a withdrawal of sorts, or a two kingdoms motif about what the relationship between the church and the world should be. But as David rightly points out, part of what you see within kind of like contemporary versions of Christian nonviolence is a wanting to address proactively causes of violence, conditions which lead to further forms of violence, things which like structures within the world, injustices which are kind of slow forms of violence. That violence is not just kind of this thing that happens somewhere out there. It's not just kind of a matter of international conflict, but it is something which is intimate to our daily lives all the time. And so the tradition is trying to recognize these things and to deal creatively with them. I mean, the question of this is where I don't know if I think David and maybe we agree on this. Maybe we disagree on it.
Well, let's find.
Let's find out, I guess. Right. So I would maybe want to distinguish between, say, force and violence. Force being simply kind of getting, force is just kind of like when I'm closing the door, I'm exercising some sort of like agency on the door to move it into a closed state. Some of my 5-year-old who's watching TV in the other room doesn't come in and bother us while we're doing this podcast, for example. So force is, there's a way of thinking about force that also involves maybe thinking about restraint. It could think about disarming, that doesn't also necessarily have to bundle together like lethal force, right? That I can think about like restraint without also having to think simultaneously about killing somebody.
Yeah.
Right. So that then gets into some interesting places, because I think that there would definitely be folks that we discussed within the book who would take that approach. They would say that, to be nonviolent is to actively oppose those instances of violence in the world, but without being willing to take human life in the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems like there's always this dance between the collective, especially government-backed violence, versus individual and personal. So I've heard some people say, well, I'm personally committed to nonviolence, but I know that our government needs to use that as a tool, and partly because our government shouldn't be bound by Christian understanding, right? It has other obligations, and we live in a pluralistic society, and it's not meant to be the hand and the force of God in a Christian way. So the government can have the use of force, but I shouldn't individually and personally. I know other people who just invert that, and they say, look, the government should stop doing harm and stop killing people. I might have to do something to use some kind of act of violence, but that I should get to decide in a moment, not to have our government do it. So can you talk a little bit about that, how people on that, whatever that spectrum is, or whatever that range of how people have thought about this over time? What if people pick up the book, Fieldguide to Christian Nonviolence, are they going to get some help in sort of sorting any of that out?
Well, they're definitely going to encounter figures who answer that question differently. And so, this is an introductory book that's designed to expose people to this whole tradition. And depending on kind of which rabbit trail you end up following yourself, you'll get different answers to that. So in the first chapter, we talk about what we call nonviolence of Christian discipleship. And this might be the most familiar to many of your listeners. This kind of like, we're disciples of Jesus. Jesus tells us not to kill people, so we don't kill people. And I think on that view, it would be a little bit more like, we're not so concerned what the state does. That's a different sphere. We're concerned what we do as individuals, or perhaps what the church does. And in some ways, that's what distinguishes the church from the state. We have this separate witness. And so a lot of the more prominent voices in Christian nonviolence over the last 30, 40 years, if you think of someone like Stanley Hauerwas, that was kind of his mantra, is like, the church needs to be the church so the world can be the world. He often says things loudly and then qualifies in footnotes. So I'm sure he would have things to say about how government should act as well. But in other chapters, we look at Christians who say, well, why shouldn't the state be less violent than it is? Do we just have to accept that as a given? Our context isn't exactly the same as it was for first century Christians in Rome. We do have a voice. So are there things we can be actively doing to at least mitigate violence in the world? And so we have a chapter that we call realist nonviolence. And these are people kind of picking up on the stream of Christian realism from Reinhold Niebuhr, who himself was not a pacifist, but he talks about things like, ambiguity and compromise and how sin affects everything we do. And some people pick up on that and say, well, yes, sin is pervasive in society, but it doesn't always have to manifest itself in the kinds of violences we see. So can we identify the particular sins, structural societal sins that manifest themselves in violence, and try to address those conditions to minimize violence? So there would be different ways of coming at that question that we highlight in the book, for sure.
A lot of people have been introduced to nonviolence in public spheres through the approach in the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King Jr. And that at that time, there was great debate in Black society and Black culture about the best way forward. And these debates that your book highlights through Christian history have also been around in the U.S. history, 50 years, 60 years ago. So it was a very live conversation, and is still today, whether nonviolent approach to our government is the best way, or the use of force to protect people from a violent government that's trying to hurt and harm its own citizens, especially Black and brown people. So this is these are still very live questions that are not anywhere close to being settled. Can you say a little bit about how you talk about the role of the civil rights movement, and especially King and his side of that movement that was arguing for nonviolence as the best way to show that the government is violence, so the alternative is to be not violent, and that's what's only going to bring about the change that we want in this expression of a beloved community?
Yeah, King is such a complicated figure. So one of the things that so he shows up in this chapter that we call nonviolence of political practice, and he shows up there alongside, say, another figure, Cesar Chavez, both of whom are using nonviolence prudentially to be able to leverage opinion, to kind of sway public opinion toward their cause, to be able to, in King's case in particular, like to shame their opponents, right? So when the dogs are turned on them or the fire hoses are turned on them, like an audience that's watching this horrifically play out on TV is just horrified by what they're seeing. And so the willingness of the protesters to engage in nonviolence just stands in such stark contrast to the ways in which the government is treating them. So what you get with that particular strain is definitely a much more it's much more tactically oriented. It's much more prudentially oriented. But for King in particular, like, this is not just a tactic that he employs, but something that he sees as very much rooted in, like, the grain of the universe. Like, this is what the world is meant to be. He picks up a lot of that from a figure that we discussed in a very different chapter, Howard Thurman. And so Thurman himself was a mystic who was not a big proponent of the marches, didn't really engage in a lot of high-profile political activity, but really developed a sense of the ways in which nonviolence is just intrinsic to spirituality, and a spirituality that speaks to the way in which God has ordered the world. And so King really picks up on that, and to say that what we're doing when we enact nonviolence in this way is we're not just trying to persuade the government to be less violent, but we're giving a display to the world about, like, this is what the world is really meant to be. Like you say, this is beloved community, like, being played out in front of your eyes.
Yeah, and it seems to me that violence is just a lowest form of action and a real admission to a lack of creativity. Like, you think about any act of violence when it's brought about, whether that's an angry outburst or systemic violence or militarization, all these things, it's because something else more beautiful, more creative, more good has failed. Mm-hmm. And even people who are proponents of violence only think you should use violence temporarily to get back to a place of greater communication, greater creativity. So it's a placeholder utilized temporarily. Somebody who is a screamer and a yeller and with outbursts, right? Whether that's at work or in personal relationships, they don't run around doing that all the time. They use it in a moment and then often apologize for it or something, and then say, well, now let's move on to create something sort of more beautiful. So it's funny that people who advocate for nonviolence really are forced to explain ourselves, and people that don't advocate for nonviolence never have to explain why violence is a good thing. It's just nonsense for people to do it at any time, and just seems like the lowest form. So, okay, that's a little mini sermon. How do you each think about that? And what do you? I mean, how have other people that you've read, that you've researched and have written about, how do they deal with that question? That violence is just dumb.
Well, I think there's a bit of a double standard where oftentimes kind of people with privilege and power can assume that they have access to legitimate forms of violence. And then people who are in marginalized or vulnerable positions who respond with violence, that's somehow illegitimate violence. And so in the chapter on liberationist nonviolence, we discuss somebody like Helder Camara, an archbishop in South America, and he himself was committed to nonviolence as a tool in the struggle for liberation. But he also said to his fellow liberationists, he's not going to judge them if they decide that violence is necessary for them. He's saying, I'm committed to nonviolence. I think it's the best way, but I also understand that oppressed communities have to make hard decisions. And the same thing is the case in the last chapter where we talk about Christian anti-violence, which is responding to sexualized violence and gender-based violence. And some of the figures we discussed there are not going to tell a victim of sexualized violence not to respond with violence. They're just going to say, we should be addressing that kind of violence proactively, again, to try to mitigate those conditions in the church. And so I'm committed to nonviolence. I don't have weapons in my home. I do the way of Jesus and goes with the grain of the universe and all of that. But I also would want to be cautious about as a person of relative privilege, like telling victims or marginalized communities there's absolutely no place for it. So that's kind of a couple chapters kind of give some room for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the places that nonviolence can sometimes go off, can become, it just needs to be aware of it at least, is when it becomes kind of a perfectionist ethic, when it assumes that all persons are kind of created in the same circumstances in the same spaces. Now, that's not the same as saying that violence is when it is enacted is a good thing, but it does. I think sometimes nonviolence can wander, can forget that people are existing in different sorts of contexts. And again, this is part of what the book tries to do, is try to acknowledge those different contexts and the ways in which nonviolence has been applied and enacted in situations that are in public policy conversations, among oppressed communities, among folks that are operating in very different kinds of contexts.
Yeah, is there like a fundamentalist form of nonviolence where people are so hardline that it almost becomes weaponized?
Yeah, that's interesting. Hadn't really thought about that. I think that's a good question, David. What do you? I mean, I have my suspicions, but
well, there are definitely communities in which nonviolence or pacifism or non-resistance is a kind of lowest common denominator for participation in that community. So, Amish communities, conservative Mennonite communities, even like Seventh-day Adventists, these things would just be assumed. And so to enlist in the military or to join the police force is going to be basically tantamount to leaving that community.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna.
Yeah,
I was gonna suggest that.
I don't know that the label fundamentalist necessarily applies, but it's certainly like a criterion for membership in that community in the way that a list of doctrines and practices would be for other communities.
Yeah, and there's a way that fundamentalism can be generous, but most isms and is don't come across to people as a positive, like we tend to use that in derogatory. I think about Jainists, people who follow a religious practice of Jainism, which is total non-impact and engagement. Even being careful about not stepping on plants or killing insects when you're walking, like really trying to be ever conscious of any kind of impact in the world. And yeah, I mean, I think there's a way that, and David, I think this is a really good question, or a comment about marginalized peoples. As somebody who thinks and has experienced violence, it's just a bad solution. I mean, it might be the thing you do at a moment to sort of get out of a very bad situation, but it perpetuates. And the Jainists and other people who are very nonviolent outside the Christian tradition, there's a lot of nonviolence traditions outside of Christianity. I don't know if you write about much of that in the book, but there's just a whole other way to orient. And I think the hard thing about living in a society that is fundamentally built around the glorification of violence as necessary. In fact, we organize for it, we prepare for it, and we utilize it very regularly and tactically in our society, in the United States and much of the Western world. It's very hard to be nonviolent in any way that doesn't make you look like you're just out of touch or being some kind of a person that's just not a realist, to borrow the phrase that you used earlier.
Yeah, and I think we need to recognize that even if we have a personal commitment to nonviolence, we are a part of a wider society that is so enmeshed in all kinds of violences. And this is something that the Mennonite community has been reckoning with themselves, where, the story that Mennonites tell ourselves is that we are this consistently nonviolent community going all the way back to the Radical Reformation. But then there's examples where different communities may have gotten kind of a pass where it was like, as long as you don't enlist in, or as long as you don't say anything about our wars, we won't make you enlist in the military. And so is that kind of arrangement really actively combating the violence of the world, or is it just kind of getting an exception for us in our community? And so there's a lot of wrestling in the Mennonite community there. But I think for those of us who are committed to nonviolence, we need to do that for ourselves, to say, okay, I may not support this war. Some people might go so far as to not even pay their war taxes or something like that. There's been, war tax resistance movements. But what other ways is my life kind of being like propped up by the military industrial complex? And so I think being circumspect about that is a good way to not get too prideful about your own kind of position on this.
Right. This is honestly where I find like the realist position that we develop in the book to be helpful. It's just an acknowledgement of kind of the embeddedness of all of us within systems and within a world that is that is violent in multiple ways all the time. Right? There is no removing ourselves from the conditions of violence. And so to talk about nonviolence is not to presume that we exist in kind of some space apart from violence that's happening, but to bear witness to something from within, like the folds of violence that's happening all the time. It doesn't give us a pass to just say that we're attending to it in one place, but I think it invites us to attend to it in all sorts of ways. So one of the places that I love, one of the things I love most about the book is where we end in the conclusion. Is that we try to draw a lot of this together to ask the question: what does all this have to do with? What does all this have to do with like a world in which we're experiencing droughts and ecological collapse and environmental catastrophe? Like, what does nonviolence have to say to that world? Such that we're not just to remind us that like the nonviolence is not something that is not a way in which we extricate ourselves from violence, but it's a way of actively engaging like all the forms of violence that are present to us all the time.
Like, did you guys write this book because you want to advocate for more people to take on a nonviolence approach? I know you're both professors, so you have many reason for how you utilize education and influence in the world. But was that part of it? Is that part of why the labor of love that goes into, by the way, not only writing a book but co-authoring a book has a particular level of strain to it? So I'm going to ask you about that in a bit. But were you writing?
Yeah.
I mean, is some of this when you spent those late nights or went away with manuscripts and were working on all this and you're telling yourself what you're doing, were you saying like, look, we want the world to be less violent, or we want people to stop killing each other or harming one another with conscious intention? Like, is that what's going on here with the creation of the Fieldguide to Christian Nonviolence, or were there other? Was that not?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. I would love it if more people took this seriously and more people adopted Christian nonviolence as a coherent approach that I think is completely consistent with the person of Jesus. I wish that I want more people to do that, and so I think that's definitely part of why writing the book. But I think part of it was just the more we got into these conversations, there was just a real lack of understanding as to what Christian nonviolence was actually about. The most people had in their minds an image of something called, as we referenced earlier, something called non-resistance, kind of a discrete removal or a separation from anything in the world, and so we're going to be nonviolent, but we're only going to be able to be nonviolent because we're actually not engaging in any of like social spaces where violence exists. So that was kind of I think that's like what most people think nonviolence is about. And so writing this book is a way of being able to say, no, that's actually not it. It's much richer and much more engaged than that. So, but you can't get people to take it seriously when they think that it's something that it's not. So you have to do the work of kind of explaining, here's the actual positions. Here's the actual internal arguments. Here are the actual figures that you've never heard of, but you need to go reckon with what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think it would be a misreading to think that this is primarily an apologetic for nonviolence. There's a lot of great books out there that'll say like the biblical case for nonviolence, or
right.
what to do about Hitler and that type of thing. And we're not doing that genre so much as kind of just a lay of the land of what it is to create better understanding across traditions. So I think of it as more invitational than kind of argumentative. But if people accept that invitation to follow the way of nonviolence, then that would be a win.
Do you each fashion yourself as an adherent to nonviolence from your Christian tradition?
David, I think, has the easier road. I mean, Mennonites are on record. This is just kind of what Mennonites are.
You can put it off as a brand.
Yeah, as a Baptist, I was thinking about this, that two of the anchor figures in our chapters that we write about are actually Baptists. You have Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr. So I didn't do that on purpose, but I'm not going to argue with it.
Dude, pretty good.
Yeah, so Baptists definitely have a much more fraught relationship with nonviolence. It's definitely a minority report within Baptist life. You find those figures, but they're few and far between.
Yeah, I think I would say I'm in progress. So like I've used the analogy before that there are certain people out there, I won't name names, but who will say, I'm the least racist person you've ever met. And that's usually
stuff. The former.
That's the name I wasn't going to mention, but you stole it thunder. And that's usually indicative of the opposite. And so to claim that I'm the least violent person you've ever met is probably a sign that you have a lot of work to do. So I think I would say nonviolence is something I'm committed to, and it's something I'm working toward, but it's a work in progress. And I think the chapter on nonviolence as Christian virtue is a good example of that, where it's the end toward which we're striving, or it's one of the ends, but we're pilgrims on the way toward that.
That's right.
Yeah, I like that. I spent a lot of time talking to Stanley Hauerwas about this in public settings and interviews like this. And, if people don't know who he is, he's a particular theologian and ethicist at Duke University. And he says things in that, as you mentioned, David, in that very Stanley Hauerwas salty sort of, character way that he does. That the reason he's a pacifist is because he's such a mean son of a bitch, right? That's his phrase. He says, I'm not a pacifist because I'm a good guy. I'm a pacifist because I'm not a good guy, and I need an ethic that keeps me from doing the thing that I would otherwise go off and do. Like that. And sometimes when people are, say like, hey, I'm committed to nonviolence, or I'm a there's not a good word other than pacifist about this. So I do a lot of anti-death penalty work because I think our government should stop killing people top to bottom. And that's criminal justice reform comes into that. And I think our militarization is a real problem, and lots of things. But then people are like, well, what about, do you eat they just start down the whataboutisms of a whole series of things, which is, Hauerwas helped me a little bit, sort of with this idea that, look, it's a commitment to just saying there's some things you think are just outside the bounds of what human beings ought to do, whether or not, I may violate that at a moment or a time, or I'm careless or non-conscious about it. I don't know. It seems like one shouldn't have to defend themselves quite so powerfully around all this. And that's been a confusing thing for me, especially in the Christian circles, like having pastors argue with you why they should have armed patrols in their churches so that they can get the shooter, sooner. It seems totally outside the bounds of what would be otherwise reasonable. But I feel like I'm the wacky person saying that stuff in most of the conversations that I've been in with people around this conversation.
I'm glad that you brought up the. Yeah. Go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, we're here to help you identity weird. So
just lean into it. That's all you have to do. That's right. Now, I'm glad that David brought up the point about virtue, insofar as I think that it really emphasizes the ways in which nonviolence is part of the school of virtue. One of the figures that I resonate with and who troubles me the most within the book is Dorothy Day, and she talks endlessly about the little way of love. And if you go read her, you go read her journals, and she is grumpy, and she complains about people, and she is fully aware of like the depth of sin in her own life. But we look at her and think that this is this amazing, virtuous person. But it's part of why she adheres to nonviolence is it's a way of virtue. It's a way of like training ourselves to be the kinds of people that we have been called to be by God. So, it's not that there is no violence in my life, but rather that I am aware of. I grow increasingly aware of the violence that I'm a part of, and the violence that I contribute to, and let that be part of the call of God to have to deal with that.
Yeah, it does seem like Christian nonviolence is the minority opinion. Like Doug said, he's the weird one in these conversations, but it hasn't always been that way. Can you talk about times where that was the predominant Christian ethic, and is there hope to get back to that?
Yeah, we begin our story pretty much in the start of the 20th century, and there was a moment, even in the U.S., where it seemed as though pacifism was kind of winning the day, and so the early social gospel movement was really tied in with this global movement to end war. But what happened was that mantra quickly became the war to end all wars. And so many of those social gospelers ended up getting involved in World War I or supporting it. But one holdout to that is probably the most well-known social gospel figure, who's Walter Rauschenbusch. And so he ended up dying of cancer just before World War I ended, but he became increasingly pacifist in the run-up to World War I because he saw the devastation that was going to leave on society, both internationally and domestically. Just when you have this society that's so focused on the war effort, it overlooks so many of the other social issues that he was so focused on. So that was one moment where I feel like, things could have gone a different direction, even here in the U.S. But then, after World War I, and then Reinhold Niebuhr kind of comes in and says, see, that shows you that whole pacifist nonsense doesn't work. But Myles, maybe there's another period you want to focus on.
Oh, yeah. I mean, ground zero for that question usually is like, well, what about the earliest Christians? How did the earliest Christians think about issues of violence? And that question is a historiographical mess. It's hard to say. I mean, without a question, we have so many disparate voices and disparate sources from the earliest days of Christianity who all point in this direction. When Jesus says that you're to love your enemy and to pray for those who persecute you, we take that seriously. That this should be kind of a no-brainer for Christians. But that doesn't mean that it was a universal, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was like a universal stance, or that there weren't dissenting opinions, or that say they were running into questions like, okay, so this soldier that I know just converted, what do I tell him to do? Right? And so some soldiers renounce it, but others don't. So it always kind of, I think even within the earliest days, like it's definitely, it seems to me that it's a more majority voice, but it's not a like unanimous, right? There's always kind of dissenting voices in the opposite direction. And after about the 4th century, then it kind of, the tide shifts the opposite direction, so that those advocating against like participation in the military and that kind of thing would be more in the minority. But it was never kind of just all one thing at all the time. But
yeah, and I imagine everyone in all the places are dealing with the sheer realities. And I guess where a lot of us could get to is, hey, we just know in human development that it helps when you move something in your consciousness from it being good or not. Like goodness matters to human beings. And so a lot of us do things that we think like, wow, that is something I would not ever normally do. Think of someone who has chemotherapy treatment for a cancer. They don't normally ingest major amounts of chemicals that cause their body to go through the things that chemotherapy puts their body through. But at some point they say, well, it's a cost benefit that's going to help me. It's going to be really hard on my body. So I can do this unique thing at this one moment for this greater outcome. That's a different negotiation than I'm just polluting my body with chemicals, right? Because that's not what you're doing. Right. So like there's a difficult walk that someone has to have. And it seems to me that it's really helpful for people to say, hey, we're in a systemic, we're in a system that uses violence systemically. Mm-hmm. And best way to get out of it is to start to say, that's a really bad thing we're doing. Let's recognize it's a bad thing. What feels like it's happened in this country repeatedly is every time we use violence on a grand scale, whether that's on our own citizens through the many ways that we've done so from or people in this land, taking our lands or enslaving people or criminal justice or wars that we do in other places, we don't say, which, I don't think goes far enough, is that like, well, this is a necessary evil. We don't even call it an evil. We just say, no, it was ultimately good. Like you guys have probably been in these conversations too. You try to convince somebody that dropping 2 nuclear weapons on the country of Japan was an evil, mm-hmm. and they will argue with you endlessly about why that wasn't an evil. We can't even call killing 100,000 people on the second time to just test an experiment as an act of evil. So it does seem like just a basic level of moving forward and saying, can we all just admit that this is not good and we never ever want to do it again? So the war to all wars. David, from your argument, like, it just feels like we're nowhere near that, whether it's in the church or the rest of our society. We glorify this nonsense as if it was the only possible way, and we call heroes the people who have to go and do it. Mm-hmm. Sorry, number 2. Any thoughts?
Well, that keys us up for maybe one of the most provocative chapters of the book, and I can say that because Myles did the first draft on it, but it's what we call apocalyptic non-violence. And basically these figures, apocalypse, we think of zombies or end times or whatever, but really it's about revealing. It's about revealing something about reality. And so proponents of what we call apocalyptic nonviolence have these dramatic acts to dramatize just how violent our society is. So when the Berrigan brothers, break into, steal draft cards and pour homemade napalm on them and burn them, that may have a small impact. The people that those draft cards names were on might not get drafted now. But the bigger dramatization is just showing just how violent we are as a society. And so I think apocalyptic nonviolence is an interesting example of what you're talking about, Doug, of like just taking stock of the fact that we are so far from that ideal, and God through Jesus reveals how to respond to that evil or that capital D death through the way of nonviolence. And so I may not be perfectly, nonviolent myself, but I do think that is the structure of the universe as revealed in the person of Jesus. So there's my little mini sermon for this morning.
Yeah, well,
there you go.
Myles, you said here, in the chat, you have to go. So any final words from you? And then, David, I want to ask you about what it goes into co-authoring. So, Myles, if you have any thought on that.
Co-authoring can be, I think David and I bring a very different set of strengths and different kinds of experiences to this project. So it was a lot of fun. Sorry, my 5-year-old.
Are those sweet little voices coming from your back? This is because co-authoring is not just what you do between the two writers and an editor. Co-authoring is what you do with all the people in your family all the time.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. No, I think David and I bring a lot of different experiences and history and strengths to the project, and so I wouldn't have been able to do this by myself for sure. I don't think when David wrote the initial article in Sojourners that kind of mapped out, I think, what would then become the more full version of the book, I was like, I think this is fantastic, and I want to partner with you because you've already kind of set the vision for what this could be, But yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Well,
Well,
congratulations.
once he jumps off, I'll give you the dirt on the rest of it.
You can tell us about the rest of it. For the anybody else that's got to go at this point, the book is called A Fieldguide to Christian Nonviolence, and it helps you see that this is a real thing. There it is, a real thing that's been happening. Myles, thanks for your time today.
Yeah,
you can stick
thanks so much.
Thank y'all for having us.
Yeah,
We'll see you later.
Take care.
Myles, so Myles, talk a little bit about the book, where people can get it, how it came together, how people made it, all the rest of that stuff. It's a Baker Books publication, is it?
Yeah, Baker Academic. It was released last week, so you should be able to get it wherever books are sold, I hope. But
I'll say when I Googled it just to find, more stuff, like the third link that came up was to buy it at Target.com. So well done to the salespeople of Baker Academic to get it landed at.
They were great to work with. They have a great editorial team and marketing team, so props to them. But as Myles said, this book kind of came as a result of an article I had written in Sojourners magazine back in, I think it was early 2016. And what had happened that kind of precipitated that article was there were revelations about John Howard Yoder, who was, the major proponent of Christian nonviolence, that for a lot of us was sort of our entrance into this tradition. And there were revelations about his own life where there was sexualized violence in his own life that was coming to light. And so I think the Sojourners folks, who Yoder had been on their masthead back in the day, and for people like me who had read our way into this tradition through him, there was a lot of soul searching around that time of like, okay, is this whole thing a sham, or where do we go from here? And so that article was just kind of a way of saying Yoder isn't the only voice in this discussion. And in fact, there's a lot of other people who would directly challenge some of the moves he makes in the politics of Jesus. There's others who would have a very similar approach as the politics of Jesus. And so it's not to say, you can completely disown him and his influence on the tradition, because he was widely influential, but it is to say you don't have to go through him in order to get to this conclusion. And so that article came out in, I think, 2016. Myles read it around the time he was on a panel where he was sort of the token pacifist and felt like the view was getting caricatured. And so we had met at Baylor, and he just reached out and said, we should blow this up into a book. And at the time, straight out of my PhD program, kind of being naive about what goes into writing a book, I was like, sure, let's do this. And we got a contract.
That would be the ultimate goal. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we did a proposal, got a contract, and then it was like, oh, we have to write this thing. So Myles is a kind of guy, like he was talking about our different strengths. He's a kind of guy who can just plow through the reading and get a draft out there and move on to the next one. So he started sending me chapters early on, and I was like, dang, how is he doing this? Because I'm like a very slow processor, and I have some background in editing. So I want my first draft to read like a final draft. So I'm just snail's pace, and he's just running laps around me. But, with his patience and my kind of determination to not let my co-author down, I got my chapters in too. And then I was able on the tail end then to do some editing to make our voices kind of sound the same. So I hope that as people read the book, like you wouldn't know this is a chapter Myles drafted or this is a chapter David drafted, but that we have kind of a unified voice. So it was an interesting process of co-authoring. I would do it again, but there were some moments where I was like, I can't let Myles down. I got to keep at it. And it was a little tough.
Well, hey, congratulations. I think it's important anytime, I know a lot of people like a historic are comfortable in a historic space. So they'll say like, there's a lot of books on nonviolence. You could pick one up anytime. Other people like something that feels a little more timely, a little more sort of now for whatever reason. And I think it's good to have both on this topic because for sure, it's not like some new idea born, in February of 2022. Of course not. It's also good to have a perspective that's like from February of 2022. That's good too, right? This isn't just an old idea. This is an idea that it would be good if people took a little bit more seriously, even in our day.
Yeah.
And I hope people find that this is both very relevant and pressing, but also drawing from the wellspring of a deep tradition. And so I hope people that pick up the book feel its immediacy, but also feel like they're being introduced to figures that maybe they've heard the name before, but didn't even realize, like, oh, they're part of this tradition. Like Henry Nouwen's one example we talk about in the mysticism chapter, where I think a lot of evangelicals or others, encountered his writing on kind of spiritual growth and that type of thing, but didn't realize that he's drawing a lot of that from his own commitments to nonviolence. So hopefully there's some familiar figures that you kind of meet again for the first time.
Yeah, I think it's great too, because I think people have an aversion to the caricature, like you hinted at, of nonviolence, or the straw man argument for nonviolence. And this really invites people into, no, this is what it actually is. This is how it actually functions in the world and is actually a better way. So I'm excited to dig into it more.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm just so far down the hole. It's like when people raise the straw man arguments, which they should, and they do, because they don't even know that they're doing straw man. They're just literally asking, like, so if somebody broke into your house, you wouldn't do anything about it. And I don't know, most of the time when people say that kind of stuff, I'm just like, I don't know, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Like, wouldn't it be better if you just didn't do anything about it? You just left? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you just got out and just went away and they took all your stuff. All right. Like, I don't know. It's just there's such a root assumption. And I think it actually comes out of biology. I think that human beings are called to overcome our biological impulses to punch another person in the face if somebody has that. And I don't know. It just seems like it's maybe it's that red pill, blue pill kind of phenomenon. Once you step over the line, you're just like, okay, it's not that big a deal to just assume that if you act in an aggressive way to harm another person, that you're doing something that's morally wrong. I don't know why we've ended up in a world that's just increasingly more violent in the United States and less condemnation of it at sort of any level. I don't, it's just bizarre to me.
Right. Well, the phenomenon I've encountered in all kinds of different discussions is that the one who's holding the minority position on any topic is usually the one who's more well-versed in it. So you almost have to become a localized scholar just to be able to, have a seat at the table in the discussion. And so it is interesting how the same 4 or 5 questions come at you every single time you have this conversation. And it's as though you'd never thought of that question before. And maybe for the person asking you, it's the first time they've really reflected on it deeply. But usually it's something that if you hold the minority view, you're very well versed in what the question is and the various ways to answer it.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, David, for all your work. Thanks for the book, and hope people buy it.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. And when you come through South Bend, look me up.
Okay, we're going to follow up with you about that conversation. We're not just going to look you up. We're going to try to work with you. All right. So,
all right, sounds good. All right, good talking to you.
Thanks.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us through that conversation. It's a complex and evolving conversation. Even in the chat today, thank you so much for contributing in the comment section. Some really great comments and debates. I've been over on Twitter as well, where the conversation among Christians is lively and diverse. And people are definitely wrestling with this question: what is our response to violence and war in the world? It seems like it's almost easier to say, yes, we should send troops, we should drop bombs to prevent a bully like Putin from continuing this invasion. But that's maybe because most of us won't have to sacrifice anything, right? Like, the average person isn't going to have to go over there and put themselves in harm's way or send a child or loved one to do that. So we don't have much skin in the game, but are we willing to increase sanctions even if it means higher gas prices for us? Are we willing to strengthen our partnerships in Europe and support them when they take a hit for closing down their oil pipelines? Are we willing to let it hit our pocketbooks? That's a question I wrestle with, and honestly, I'm with you. A lot of you in the comments. I'm not sure where our responsibility ends. Like, should we put ourselves in harm's way to prevent this violence? Should we use force to stop the bully that is Putin? I don't know. I'm with you in wrestling with that, but it's a conversation we need to be having, and it feels more urgent than ever. So thank you so much to David and to Myles for writing this book. It's a lot to think about and wrestle with, and we'll be back next week with Doug Pagitt back, and we'll have some more great conversations. But as we're wrestling with this and as we're figuring out how to respond as Christians and as people of good faith and good conscience, we can definitely be pushing for less violent responses. We're talking about an armed conflict with a nuclear power, and there are things that we can demand that we take off the table, that we demand that we don't even bring up the idea of using nuclear weapons. And hopefully that's a starting place where people across the board can agree, like, bombing a whole city of civilians to prevent a war is too high a cost, morally and literally. So hopefully we can find some common ground in things, lines that we should not cross for any reason. Rachel says, if he isn't stopped, he won't stop with Ukraine. I think that's true. I think we need to stop him, or he will only be more emboldened. It's just a matter of what tools are we willing to use and what tools are we not willing to use to do that. So thanks again to everyone in the comments. Let's try to put some more common good energy into this world as it's hurting and breaking. Sending love to all you.